A key part of Hitler's appeal to the German people was that he promised he would improve the lives of those people, particularly dealing with unemployment and improving living standards. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the Nazi policies to reduce unemployment, changes in the standards of living and how people lived and whether life was better under the Nazis. In particular, look at the organisations that tried to improve standards of living, and overall be looking at how successful these policies and actions were by the Nazis. So when Hitler came to power in 1933 as Chancellor, about 5 million German people were unemployed, which is roughly 25% of the labour force. So this was clearly a big issue for Hitler. Now in particular, he thought this was an issue because he was worried that these unemployed people were politically dangerous, as people who were unemployed were more likely to turn to parties like the communists, who promised full employment and to share things equally. Hitler also saw unemployment as a burden to the German nation. Now, he had promised he would make the German nation strong again, and he wanted as many of these people to be working or employed to help make Germany strong. And by 1939, to many observers, he had succeeded because unemployment had fallen to 300,000 people, showing a huge difference from 1933. So we're going to look at how the Nazis did this, how exactly they reduced unemployment. Now, we're going to talk about 4 different methods. First of all, we're going to look at the Labour Service, or the RAD, which was an organisation which got the unemployed working again. We're going to look at autobahns, or motorways, and the project to build these. Rearmament, and employing people to work directly for Nazi groups. And then lastly, how he used the changing statistics and the invisible unemployed to drive down these numbers. Now, first of all, the Nazis set up the Labour Service, or the RAD. Now, this was an organisation to provide paid work for the unemployed that the Nazis set up immediately when they took power in 1933. They're put to work on public projects, such as repairing roads, planting trees and draining marshes. And these large projects were designed to give these people jobs, but also improve Germany overall. It was initially voluntary, but then it was made compulsory from 1935. So it was initially set up just for the unemployed, but then later on they decided that all young men should have to serve in the Labour Service for 6 months, which pushed the number up to 422,000. And don't forget, many of those people would normally have been unemployed, making a big impact on unemployment statistics. And the flaw of this is it was not very popular. It was organised like the army. Workers had to wear uniforms, they lived together in camps with very basic accommodation, and they did military drills and parades as well as work. The rates of pay were very low, and some complained of poor food and living conditions. And in some ways, you've got to realise that having this cheap labour service also probably undercut other jobs, as other people couldn't compete with the RAD in providing these services across Germany. However, it's clear that many people found work through the labour service. The next key area that the Nazis used was large building projects to try and improve the nation. And by far the most famous of these was the Autobahn building scheme. Now, Autobahn is just a German word for motorway, but motorways didn't really exist back in 1933. So this was a planned 7,000-mile network of dual carriageways or motorways across Germany to improve transport. And actually you can see from this picture here that in September 1933, Hitler personally started the construction of the first Autobahn, and the first section was opened in 1935. By 1935, 125,000 men were involved in building motorways, and by 1938, 3,500 kilometres had been finished. And as I said earlier, this is just one example of the public building works that the Nazis created. Spending on public works grew from 18 billion marks in 1933 to 38 billion marks by 1938. And all of these projects involved employing great numbers of workers to complete them. Now, these projects created many jobs, but something like the autobahns also helped transport around the country and improve trade and communication. And to some observers, the Autobahn project is probably the Nazis' biggest long-lasting impact on Germany, and to a certain extent other countries as well, which followed suit. A third way in which the Nazis improved unemployment was by boosting the German armed forces. Now, this was a key aim for Hitler anyway, because he wanted to overturn the hated Treaty of Versailles, make Germany strong again, and start to take back the German land that was given away by the Treaty of Versailles. Now, you may remember that under the treaty, the German army was limited to 100,000 men, which was tiny, and Hitler wanted to increase this, which would automatically give jobs to people. So it's helping to reduce unemployment as he announced military conscription from 1935, which meant that all young German men would have to serve in the armed forces for a period of time. By 1939, the army had jumped from 100,000 to 1,360,000 men in the armed forces, clearly showing a large impact on the number of people unemployed. Alongside actually joining the armed forces, the Army, Navy or Air Force, there's also many more jobs in the arms industry, as spending on weapons went from 3.5 billion marks in 1933 to 26 billion marks by 1939, as the German army needed to be equipped, clothed, housed, and given all the things that are needed for the armed forces. For example, in aircraft construction alone, the number of people employed went from 4,000 in 1933 to 72,000 by 1939. And also Hitler increased the Nazi organisations, so there are hundreds of thousands of men employed in the SA, SS, Gestapo, SD, all the Nazi security services also employed people, which would have an impact on unemployment. A critique of the Nazi employment statistics is that actually they were not accurate, as they made a lot of unemployment invisible in a variety of ways. And some historians have argued that there was actually at least an extra 1.5 million people who were unemployed who the Nazis effectively hid from the statistics. First of all, and most famously, women and Jews were forced to give up work and were not counted in the statistics. So as we know already, women were forced really to stay at home and give up work, and Jews were no longer considered citizens and could not take part in lots and lots of different jobs, so they were not counted. Another criticism is that working for the RAD, the Labour Service, was not real employment, as it was temporary and people didn't learn new skills, but it kept a large part of people out of the unemployment statistics. The Nazis also did simple things like counting people in part-time work as fully employed, improving their statistics. And another criticism is that the amount of people who were employed in the army or making weapons was not sustainable. These people were employed as Germany was getting ready for war and trying to kind of reduce the machinery and get the army big enough to fight the war. However, the war would never have lasted forever, and so these jobs were temporary, and the German government could not have afforded to pay for them forever. And lastly, there were also many people who held as political prisoners in concentration camps or prisons, which would have also reduced the unemployment figures. So we're now going to move on to look at changes in the standard of living. Now what this means is whether people's lives are getting better or worse. And actually this is a very difficult thing to measure, because sometimes the standard of living would go up for some but not others. For example, workers versus women and Jews. Sometimes some aspects of life got better and others got worse. And sometimes people can get wealthier, but their lives' enjoyment can actually get worse. So it's hard to measure, but there are ways we can look at it. Now clearly, unemployment reduced a great deal, even if you take into account invisible unemployment. So it's clear that for many people, they were now employed, and so their standard of living would improve. However, there is a flaw here. For many groups, such as Jews or women, they would not benefit as they were not employed, or if you had two working parents, even though the man, or the father or husband, would more likely be employed, the woman would be less likely employed, so the household might be worse off. Also, the people often hated being part of the labour service, and so you could argue that their standard of living did not improve, even if they did get a form of job. And actually, the money they received from being part of the labour service was often less than they had previously received from being unemployed. So arguably, the standard of living was worse. Now, in general, wages did improve during this time. They'd risen on average by 20% by 1939. However, it was varied from industry to industry. So if you worked in the armaments industry, your wages definitely would have improved, as there's a big demand for armaments or weapons and things for the armed services. However, people who work in the labour service were paid a very low wage, so not all wages had increased. Also, the price of goods, so the price you would pay for anything in the shops, rose a great deal in this time. So although wages rose by 20% between 1934 and 39, the price of goods had risen at a quicker rate by 45%. So actually, some people were worse off by 1939. And again, that would depend on how much your wages increased. The number of hours worked also rose. So the average working week for a German worker was 43 hours in 1933, but by 1939 it increased to 49 hours a week. So effectively, although some people's wages had gone up, they were working longer hours and they could buy less with the money that they were making. Now, Hitler realised that the Nazis needed to have organisations that affected standard of living, try to improve it. And the first of these is the Labour Front. So they knew how important the workers were, and they wanted to make sure they were happy, not because they wanted the people to be happy, but because they knew that workers were vital to keep the German state running and to make it strong. And so they wanted to make sure that they were looking after them and making sure that they were happy. Now, normally, trade unions exist to try and help and improve the standards of living for workers, but Hitler had banned trade unions in 1933 as they had links with the Communist Party, and trade unions fundamentally were about trying to improve the lives of workers for the workers, rather than what Hitler wanted, which was to try and ensure the workers were happy so the German state could improve. To replace them, he created the Labour Front, the DAF, to protect the rights of workers. Now, there's a very important difference here. Trade unions, as we say, existed and were run by the workers to protect the workers. The Labour Front was there to help the workers, but fundamentally was run by the Nazis, so it was in the interest of the Nazis they were trying to help the workers. They did try and protect workers' rights, and so they looked at things like the maximum length of the working week and minimum pay, as well as workers' rights in general, to try and ensure the workers were happy. However, they were a lot less effective at protecting rights than trade unions, as workers were no longer allowed to negotiate with employers, and they weren't allowed to go on strike or use the tactics that trade unions would use. And things happened like the maximum length of the working week went up by about 6 hours per week. And also, the Labour Front, unlike trade unions, could punish workers for disrupting production, showing clearly that they were a Nazi organisation to try and help the workers, but also ensure they were productive. And this is this fundamental point, that it existed to ensure that both the workers and businesses were effectively working in the interests of the German state, rather than the trade union idea of working to try and help the workers alone. The next organisation that existed to help the German people was the Strength Through Joy group, or KDF, which is actually a subsection of the DAF. Now, this existed to make working more enjoyable for ordinary German people. They provided many things to try and ensure a happy life for German workers, such as sports events, films, theatre shows, outings and holidays. Now, in the Berlin area alone, for example, there were 19,000 lectures delivered by Strength Through Joy with 1 million people involved, 21,000 theatre performances with 11 million people involved, and so on, showing that they put on a great deal of events for the German people. One of the most famous and exciting ones for the German people was that the most loyal workers could win impressive holidays. And by 1938, 10 million people were taking KDF holidays going abroad through the Strength Through Joy programme. By 1936, 35 million Germans were members taking part regularly in KDF organisations and activities. Now, they were also behind the design of a new affordable car for the workers. Now, this was because Hitler asked a man called Ferdinand Porsche to design a car for 4 people which could travel 40 miles to the gallon and which the average German could afford. And he came up with the Volkswagen, which we still see today. Now, the Volks means people and wagon means car, so it's literally the car for the people. Now, this was very clever from Hitler because he built his motorways, and the motor car had always been a luxury for the rich, and he was trying to make sure the German workers could really feel the benefit of the Nazi system by allowing them this Volkswagen. Now, workers could give 5 marks on their wages a week to save up for their car, and would then have it delivered. Now, the flaw in this was that it ended up being a big scam. They did set up factories to create these Volkswagens, but the people who were giving 5 marks a week never received their car, because before the cars could be built and these people could have bought their car, war broke out and these factories were turned into factories for producing weapons. So the Volkswagen is probably the most famous part of the Strength Through Joy, but also it is the most flawed, as the people never actually received their cars. The final organisation we're going to look at was the Beauty of Labour, or SDA. Now, this was again another branch of the KDF, but this focused on improving facilities for workers in the actual workplace. So they worked on improving toilets, changing rooms, showers and canteens in factories and workplaces, and to try and ensure that they were nicer places to work. Now, this organisation did give tax breaks, so effectively giving the employers money to help with the building and decorating costs. However, what the employers often did was expected the workers to actually carry out this work to improve the toilets, changing room, showers, etc. themselves without paying them, and often they were forced to do this. By 1938, the Nazis claimed that nearly 34,000 companies had improved their facilities, showing that there was an impact from this in trying to improve the working standards of people in Germany. So overall, how much did the Nazis improve the lives of the German people? Now, it's very hard to move away from the fact that unemployment did drop from 5 million to 300,000 by 1939, which clearly would have a large impact on people's standard of living if they were able to work. However, we know there's big problems with these figures due to invisible unemployment, potentially up to another 1.5 million who were unemployed, but also there was a worldwide recovery from the Great Depression at this time. So actually it wasn't just Germany who were creating more jobs at this time, many countries were, although it is suggested that Germany were creating these jobs quicker and had a larger recovery. Also, many of the jobs were unsustainable, and they could not have continued to fund the armed services or some of the great works in the way they were doing in the long term. Wages did increase, but so did the cost of things, and people expected to work longer hours. And there were other issues as well. So occasionally there were food shortages as the Nazis forced the farmers to produce less to try and raise their prices, to try and raise some money for the farmers. So there were other issues that did come up at this time, which maybe suggest that the standard of living didn't improve that much. They did set up organisations like the Labour Front, Strength Through Joy and Beauty of Labour to try and improve conditions, but all of them had their flaws. The Labour Front not being as effective as trade unions. Strength Through Joy did put on a lot of things for many people, but their most famous initiative about the Volkswagen never came to fruition. And the Beauty of Labour did improve working conditions, but often using the actual workers themselves to do work for free to do this. So in summary, unemployment was a key focus for Hitler due to dangers of high numbers of unemployed. The Nazis used a variety of things, from the labour service to the Autobahn building and other great works, and rearmament to reduce unemployment, and this definitely had an impact. However, also many of the people who were unemployed were invisible, i.e. not counted in Nazi statistics because they were in concentration camps, they were Jews, they were women, or they were working part-time rather than full-time. There is evidence that the standard of living improved due to higher wages and the fact that more people were employed, but the cost of goods also raised, so it would not improve at all. The Nazis created the Labour Front, Strength through Joy and Beauty of Labour to improve living and working standards for Germans. So undoubtedly, unemployment decreased, but unclear if other areas saw real improvements or not.